The Constitutional Convention of 1787 covered a lot of topics, but one of the biggest topics discussed during the first few months were the merits of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. Basically, an argument about how the states would be represented in the Congress of the nation, whether it should be based on population or based on the number of states. Go watch the previous part for more info. It was by July 2nd of 1787, with the New Jersey Plan being rejected once again and the convention coming to a complete standstill, that some states had threatened to leave. And that's when one Roger Sherman and his mighty pen saved the day with what we now call the Connecticut Compromise. Okay, so maybe it wasn't just Sherman, and it certainly wasn't that easy. So let's real quick discuss a key fact here in the discussion about the Connecticut Plan. So the smaller states disliked the idea of the Virginia Plan with two main factors. One, obviously, they would have less representation than the bigger states, and they felt like they would be, overwritten by the bigger states, and that was unacceptable to them. And some also among the smaller states felt that the convention had lacked the full authority to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. And this split was really seen based in the North and South divide. And to really understand why that divide happened on why different states like the Virginia plan, I went ahead and made a map of roughly the U.S. borders circa July 2nd, 1787. Now, due to the software I used to make this, it is using modern county borders, which is incorrect, but it's generally, you get the gist of it. Now, real quick, let's zoom in here on New England, where most of the modern borders are here. Note that Massachusetts at the time had claimed all of Maine and had a large chunk of Canada, but that isn't represented here. But a lot of the noticeable changes is that one, Vermont doesn't exist. Two, a little bit of New York is disputed by Pennsylvania. And three, Maine is obviously gone. And four, Connecticut actually has some claim to the northeast Ohio Valley. And that claim would be given up shortly. Now, as you can see, most of the modern borders of the states had already been established. New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, Maryland, which in this example is a northern state, all have their modern borders. New York is very close to their modern borders. Massachusetts is very close to their modern borders. You get the idea. Now let's contrast this with the South. Now looking down here in the South, Virginia is massive. It's holding Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And if that state were to exist today, it would be the fifth largest state by population and the eighth largest state by area. And here are the stats for what I will refer to as Greater North Carolina and Greater Georgia. The only southern state that really has recognizable borders as of today would be South Carolina. And if you look between North Carolina and Georgia, there's that line of disputed. That was a dispute between the federal government and South Carolina, because South Carolina wanted that and eventually would be given to Georgia and whatnot, but not important. So what this means fundamentally is that the southern states were way bigger and thus were way had way more ability to grow. They weren't really capped like the northern states were. And that's why so many of the southern states were really for the Virginia plan, because they had room to grow. They could gain a massive population. And Massachusetts is a northern state that was for the Virginia plan, a bit of a outlier of the northern states, because as of this year, roughly, Massachusetts had the biggest population in the entire continental U.S. It was pretty big. Boston was a massive city back then.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning board.
So The morning of July 2nd, 1787 seemed like any other, another day of stalemate at the convention, and last night an amendment to make every state have equal representation in the House failed 5 to 6. The small states, however, called for another vote. This time, whether due to luck or fate, the vote would be 5 to 1. The states vote north to south, and Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware all voted yes. Maryland only had one delegate there that day. Here he is, and he also voted yes. And his counterpart, who was late and missed the actual vote, was against the amendment and would have voted no, and that would have caused the amendment as a whole to fail. Then the southern states, all of them voted no, along with Massachusetts, who had the largest population at the time. And right then and there, the vote was 5 to 5, and it came down the last state to vote, who was Georgia, who just last night had voted no. Yet of the four Georgia delegates, two of them, William Pierce and William Few, had left to return to New York in order to work at the Continental Congress that was still functioning at the time, leaving just two delegates, native Georgian William Houston. Yes, Georgia did have three Williams representing them, and Mr. Baldwin. Mr. Baldwin had actually grown up in Connecticut, and it was because perhaps of this that he voted yes on this amendment, leaving Georgia divided, thus making the vote as a whole 5 to 1, a complete impasse. And as Washington officially closed that round of voting, one Mr. Jennifer entered the convention, a delegate, the other delegate for Maryland, and had he been allowed to vote, the final vote would have been 4-5-2, making the amendment for all states to be equal in the House to fail. Rufus King of Massachusetts had called for another vote, hoping to finally end the argument with a proportional vote victory. Yet Mr. Washington, who had the sole power in what is voted on, decided against another vote. And it was perhaps due to this impasse that one General Pinckney of South Carolina rose up and said that they should create a committee in order to forge a compromise. Roger Sherman would agree and stated, quote, "We are now at full stop, and nobody, he supposed, meant we should break up without doing something." Roger Sherman and some of the other delegates were beginning to understand that this issue had been going on for far too long, and it was putting a real threat to the convention as a whole. You know, some states were becoming very frustrating and just were thinking about scrapping the whole new constitution and just working with the Articles of Confederation. And James Madison and James Wilson both opposed the committee, thinking it would do nothing and just delay the outcome. And in the end, only Pennsylvania voted against making a committee. And thus the convention was adjourned until Thursday of that week, not only to give the committee some time to work, but to allow the gentlemen to attend celebrations on the anniversary of the independence of the country.
Get on a raft with Taft, boys, get on the winning boat.
July 5th, 1787, after coming back from a night of Independence Day celebrations, the committee would also come back with the compromise. In this unofficial report, as they called it, the committee would propose two chambers: the Senate, the upper house, as it would come to known to be, and the House of Representatives, aka the lower house. The proposal suggested that the House of Representatives have one seat per 40,000 people, with slaves counting as three-fifths a person. I will do a whole video on the evolution of the slavery debate during the Constitutional Convention, but for now, the three-fifths number had been decided, I believe, early June or late June. It was quickly decided. He also concluded that the Senate should have each state should have one vote and no more. And like all good compromises, no one was truly happy. James Madison was still upset at the idea of the lower house Pierce Butler was upset that the lower house was done by population rather than property or wealth, and the energy in the room as a whole was general disappointment, with those upset at the upper house saying it looks too much like the current Continental Congress, which was just absolutely useless and not doing anything, and those upset at the lower house often stating that it was unfair with the population or other things. For example, one Mr. Jerry had a lot of issues with this compromise. But he had understood that a compromise is a compromise, so despite many of his objections, he knew without this said compromise, the very nation would fall apart. And in his diaries that we would gather later, he basically went along with it in the hopes that he could keep the nation together. July 6th, matters on the compromise would be once again taken up. The previous night was full of arguments about the merits of said compromise, but today's arguments was mostly about how each man in the Congress should be represented. One Mr. Morris believed in a flat 40,000, and each state under 40,000 would be granted the minimum of one. The minimum of one would make it to the final draft, but the number of 40,000 was greatly debated upon. Elbridge Gerry believed in a system of using both population and wealth for representation. Rufus King also believed in a wealth population based system, and he was one of the first ones to bring up the Northwest Territories and how they should be turned into states, saying once a territory reaches the same population as the smallest state, they can be admitted. At the end of that day, they simply created another committee, mostly comprised of only pro wealth representation individuals, such as Elbridge Gerry and Rufus King were both on this new committee. They simply created another committee from pro wealth representation individuals. Elbridge Gerry and Rufus King would both be on this committee, and the only one person, I believe Mr. Morrison, who was a pro population representative, would be on this new committee. Any financial bill had to originate from the lower house. And the eventual outcome of that argument was the idea that, listen, the House is for the people by the people, the Senate was for the states by the states. And thus, if it's the people's money being touched, it made sense that only the lower house was allowed to play with money, basically. And that was the argument that would eventually settle on. And yeah. Eventually, by July 12th, the convention had met again after a small adjournment. And this time they wanted to discuss how each state would be taxed. At the end of the day, states would be taxed on people or land, and most southern states had favored it because the idea would give legitimacy to the idea that slaves need to be counted in the census, which would give them more representation. They also would eventually land on the idea that a census would be about every 10 years. And yeah, it was finally July 15th, 1787, that the convention voted on the whole report from the Grand Committee, aka most of the Connecticut Compromise. This included a census, a baseline of 65 congressmen, all financial bills come from the House, money drawn from the Treasury must also be approved by the House, and finally, the second branch is that each state has an equal vote. The vote passed, and supposedly it was to the shock of some of the nationalists, some of the large state people who thought it would fail. Edmund Randolph, the writer of the Virginia Plan, would speak, stating he wants to call another adjournment until the small states wanted to be serious, because the small states demanding equal representation in the Senate was unacceptable. William Patterson, a rival of sorts, would blurt out that if they want to adjourn until the small states became serious, it would be a permanent adjournment. Randolph would clarify that he misspoke and only meant an adjournment until tomorrow. Williams was fine with that, and they adjourned with a 1 day adjournment. And the simple question that was proposed nearly a month ago was still being argued every single day. the idea of how the state should be represented in the new House. It would finally be July 17th, 1787, in which the argument would end, as the states had decided not to re-vote on the equality of states in the Senate, basically ending the argument. The outcome of the whole Connecticut Compromise and whatnot would be a two legislative system. The upper house, to be known as the Senate, would represent the state's interests, would have a higher minimum age requirement than the House of 35, and they would serve longer 6-year terms. At the time, they would also be elected by the state legislative branches rather than by the people. That wouldn't change until a amendment way down the line. A main point of the Senate, really, is it has to stonewall fads and trends. And the idea was that a lot of the people who were designing the Senate, especially James Madison, for example, they were very worried about a potential power group gaining power in the nation really fast and just breaking up a lot of the institutions that the nation had held, you know? Realistically, another word, they were very afraid of like a populist, you know, system rising up real quick because a lot of our founding fathers were very anti-democracy, and you will hear this argument a lot during the next video, which is going to be on the presidential or the president's office. A lot of them were anti-democracy because they simply did not have enough trusts in the common Joe. Kind of, they believe that the state legislatives, the legislators themselves, would have a way better understanding of the issues and how to fix them. Thus, they should be kind of in charge more, and the common man wouldn't really be able to comprehend the issues that are at play, you know. And they were afraid of people abusing the common man in a sense and using a populist movement for bad purposes. So the idea of the Senate was it was a stonewall against them. It's a pain to remove a senator. You know, they have a 6-year term. The Senate was broken up into three different classes, so not all the senators would be up for re-election, which means realistically, if you have like a really popular movement that wants to harm the nation or fundamentally change the nation really fast, you know, on a whim, generally you have to wait a minimum of 12 years to get it done because two classes of Senate have to go through in order for half of the senators to be up for election, you know? And even then, you have to fight your way through the state legislatures to get your guys into position. That was the idea of the Senate. The lower house would be allowed to violently change, well, not violently, like radically change it every 2 years because all of them were up for reelection every 2 years. They would be elected by the people, and that was allowed to have that change. And the advantage in this system was that the House was allowed to play with people's money. The House could decide what to spend it on, what not to spend it on. That was some of the balancing that had to happen there. The uh, The only change that would happen to the compromise post July 17th, 1787 would be on July 23rd, actually, in which Madison and I believe Rufus King of Massachusetts both would argue that the Senate should be changed from one state to one vote to each senator, two per state, would each have their own vote. Because the idea they wanted was they wanted more elite individuals in the Senate to have more power. And the way they argued for this was the fact that the current Continental Congress, it's not, I think it's Continental Congress, the current Congress under the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote but had multiple delegates. And that would mean a lot of states would just end up not voting because they were divided, you know? And like, you could have votes where some of the states just were not represented because their guys were too busy arguing. And thus, they argued that it would be better if each representative had a vote, and two per state. So you get how we got that. So the Connecticut Compromise was finally done, but only more debates would be taken up. The powers of said Congress, the powers of the executive branch, how those two would interact, and all more would be brought up at the convention. But for now, one of the biggest arguments they had was done. And next time, as I alluded to earlier, we will be covering the arguments surrounding the executive branch and the journey it went on before becoming what popped out in the Constitution. So thank you all for watching. I've been William Tavstan. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. Share it with your grandma. Share it with, I don't know. I'll leave it on autoplay while your cat's watching. It helps the algorithm. Thank you all. Have a good night, or day, or evening, or afternoon, or morning, whenever you're watching. Thanks.